Hello and welcome to the session today. This is a session for the resident panel and it's all about how to complain to your landlord. So my name is Victoria King. I'm one of the sector learning and development leads here at the Housing Ombudsman Service, and I'm joined today by my colleague Anthea Chilton, who will be delivering the second part of the session. Anthea, did you want to come on and say hi?
Hi everyone, I'm Anthea Chilton, so I'm the other sector learning and development lead at the Housing Ombudsman Service and looking forward to doing the session with you today.
So you might be aware of our dispute support and dispute resolution functions here at the Housing Ombudsman Service, but there's also us in the Quality Engagement and Development Department, and there's a few of us, not just me and Anthea. We are part of the Insight and Development function, and we're sector learning and development. And the aim of our work is to share the insight and the learning from complaints. We look to identify themes, trends, and one-off instances of learning that everyone can benefit from. And we share this through our Centre for Learning, where we've got lots of resources like reports, podcasts, videos, case studies, e-learnings, micro-learnings, webinars. There's a load of things, and we're adding to them all the time. And this, we aim to help landlords understand the right way to handle complaints and residents to understand when they can use our service and what to expect from their landlord as well. You as the resident panel are ambassadors for our service, and we're running these sessions so we can support you in raising awareness of how residents can raise complaints with their landlords. So objective 3 of the resident panel is to learn more about the Housing Ombudsman Service. And objective 4 is to talk to others to ... help us reach residents in your local community and raise awareness of the service. There are existing resources available for you as well on the Housing Ombudsman Service website, but we know that not everybody will have access to these resources. So we're running these webinars to really try and maximise the learning impact of these resources further. So thank you for joining us today. So the aim of today's session is to explain how a resident can complain to their landlord about issues in their home. And this really is an information session, so we're going to be providing you with lots of information today. We've got some questions that you can participate in during the session today, so please have a go at those. The objectives of today's session are to be able to distinguish between the difference between a complaint and a service request, identify the information that should be included in a complaint. So we're going to have a look first at what the difference is between the service request and a complaint. So a service request is a way for residents to ask their landlord to take action to put something right. So for example, carry out a repair in their home. Now your landlord should have a policy and procedure for how it will respond to a request and provide a variety of channels to do so. So for example, phone, email, or online portal. An example of a service request would be something like reporting a repair, an incident of ASB, or a problem with your tenancy. Now, service requests, they're not complaints, but they still need to be recorded, monitored, and reviewed regularly. And your landlord should tell you how it will respond to the report you've made and set out what action it's going to take as a result of that report. So I've got an example service request for you here. So this is Richard. Richard rings his landlord to report that his toilet is leaking. He asks the landlord if it will send somebody out to his property to take a look. The reason why this is a service request is because Richard is calling his landlord to report an issue in his home and is asking the landlord to send somebody out to investigate the issue and put things right. So on the slide now is a definition of what a complaint is. So in our complaint handling code, we say it's an expression of dissatisfaction, however made, about the standard of service, actions or lack of action by a landlord, its own staff or those acting on its behalf, affecting the resident or group of residents. So basically a complaint, it's an expression of dissatisfaction. If you've reported an issue to your landlord, and you don't think the landlord has taken appropriate action or has responded in a suitable way, you can make a complaint to them to let them know what you think has gone wrong. Landlords shouldn't stop their efforts to address the service request if a resident does end up complaining. The complaint is not a request for service, and it should be handled in line with the landlord's complaint policy. A resident doesn't have to use the word complaint for it to be treated as a complaint. Basically, whenever a resident expresses dissatisfaction, landlords must give that resident the option, the choice to make a complaint. An effective complaint handling, it enables residents to be heard and understood. So here we've got an example of a complaint. So it's Richard again. Richard rang his landlord to come out and take a look at the leak in his toilet 4 weeks ago. Since then, the landlord has not contacted to arrange a visit, and the leak has now started to ruin the flooring. Richard emails the landlord to make a complaint as he is unhappy with the time the landlord has taken to arrange a visit to the property, and the issues have now impacted the property condition. So this is an example of a complaint. It's a complaint rather than a service request because Richard is expressing dissatisfaction with the way that the landlord has responded and the level of action it has taken in response to the service request he made. So a question for you now. So I'd like you to tell me and have a little think about, is this case a complaint or a service request? So this is Susan. Susan calls her landlord to let it know that she has noticed there is mould growing on her bathroom windowsill and asks if the landlord can send somebody out to inspect it. Do you think that's a complaint or a service request? So this is a service request because Susan's letting her landlord know that she has noticed there's an issue in her home and she would like the landlord to investigate. Okay, so another question for you now. Do you think this is a complaint or a service request? So it's Susan again. She rings the landlord to let it know that she's unhappy because it's now been more than 5 weeks since she heard from the landlord and the mould has now spread to the walls. She lets the landlord know that the surveyor said he would send a team to investigate further and told her to wipe it off in the meantime. So do you think that's a complaint or a service request? So that's a complaint because Susan's letting the landlord know that she's unhappy with the standard of service provided by the surveyor that attended the property and that the issue has still not been resolved. So we've had a look at what is a complaint, what's a service request. When should a resident make a complaint after reporting something? When should you be complaining? Well, you need to let your landlord know if you're unhappy as soon as possible so that they can work with you to look at fixing the issue. Some landlords put in their complaint policy that you need to let them know about an issue within a certain amount of time. So if you have reported an issue to your landlord and you do not think it's taken the right action, then you must let your landlord know as soon as you can. The landlord will have its own procedures for how it responds to requests for repairs, reports of antisocial behaviour, for example, or any other issues that you might be having with your home. Now, the landlord must acknowledge your complaint in writing within 5 working days, and in most cases, it will give you a reference number for that particular complaint. So the next question is, can my landlord refuse my complaint? So a landlord can decide not to accept a complaint, and if they do so, then they must be able to evidence the reasoning. So each complaint needs to be considered on its own merits. The landlord's complaint policy will set out the circumstances in which a matter will not be considered as a complaint or escalated, and these circumstances must be fair and reasonable to residents. So some examples of exclusions might be that the issue has happened over 12 months ago, that the matter is subject to legal proceedings that have started. So this would be if details of the claim, such as the claim form and particulars of the claim, have been filed at court. Or it could be that the issues have previously been considered under the complaints policy already. If the landlord is refusing to accept the complaint, it needs to provide a response in writing, setting out its reasons and details of how to refer that decision to the Housing Ombudsman Service. So, say for example, you've decided to make a complaint. You need to tell your landlord what you think has gone wrong. that will give the landlord the best chance to resolve the issue for you. Try and make a complaint in writing if you can, for example, by email, letter, or an online portal, if your landlord has one, and make sure you keep a copy for your records. If you do make a complaint by phone, make a note of the date and the time and the name of who you spoke to, and also ask for a reference number. Your landlord should be making it accessible for residents to make complaints, and they should be accepting complaints via different methods. So, as I mentioned earlier, email, post, phone, and or online portals, for example. It should also have its complaint policy published on its website. If you don't have access to the website, or perhaps the landlord doesn't have a website, then copies of the complaint policy should be provided by post or in person. So who are you going to complain to when you're deciding to make a complaint? So your landlord should have a dedicated policy and procedure covering how you can make a complaint about it. Our complaint handling code says that a landlord's complaint procedure must be accessible and provide a variety of channels for residents to be able to make a complaint. When you're contacting the landlord, make it really clear that your complaint is a complaint and address it to the complaints team or department if you can. Your landlord is responsible for ensuring that a complaint is raised by the appropriate team or department, and they shouldn't be showing you any detriment to you as a resident because you are making that complaint. The complaint is actually a really good opportunity for the landlord to put things right, to learn from where things have gone wrong, so that those same issues won't keep happening. So who's going to investigate your complaint once you've submitted it? So your landlord should have a dedicated team or a person that handles complaints, and the complaints team might work with other areas of the organisation if other teams were involved in the issue. They'll do this to make sure that they investigate the issues you have raised in your complaint. So, for example, if the complaint is about a repair, they might ask the contractors what happened, or if it was ASB, they might loop in with the housing officer. Not all landlords do this because it often depends on the size of the organisation and whether they have a team dedicated to complaints handling. But if the complaint is being reviewed at stage 2, so you escalate it from stage 1 to stage 2, the investigation needs to be undertaken by somebody that wasn't involved at stage 1. I'm going to hand over now to Anthea for the rest of the presentation.
Thank you, Victoria. So I'm going to start off with a question for you, and that's thinking about if you do complain to your landlord, what do you think you should put in the complaint? I'll give you a few moments just to consider that and think about if you're complaining to your landlord, what might you include in that complaint? Okay, hopefully you've had a chance to have a think about that. You should tell your landlord when you first reported the issue, any actions that your landlord has taken since, what you think it should have done, what impact this has had on you, and what you would like the landlord to do to put things right. So that might be carry out the repair or pay you compensation, for example. You can see here that there's a template on the screen, which is for our website where we have a example complaint, and I will pop a link to this with the recording of this session so you can access it, but it's on our website there for you to look at. Your landlord might contact you for additional information or ask to visit your home to investigate the issues you've raised. It's really important to keep that communication open with your landlord because this will increase the opportunity to find a resolution. We know that it can be frustrating when things go wrong, but working with your landlord offers a chance to put things right and may help to resolve your issues sooner. So what to expect when you do complain? The code sets out that a landlord must have a 2-stage complaint procedure, and it also sets out the timescales for the responses to your complaint. So to start off with, we'll look at stage 1 of the process, and then we'll come to stage 2 later on. Your landlord needs to acknowledge a complaint at stage 1 of its process within 5 working days. And once your landlord has acknowledged your complaint, it then has 10 working days from that date of acknowledgement to supply you with a written response. Usually your landlord's response will be by email. If they don't respond to you in writing, you should ask them to, so you have a record. If your landlord doesn't respond in line with the timescales, we have a dispute support team and they can help you get a response. You can approach the dispute support team by email, through our web form, by phone or by post. We will ask to see a copy of the complaint that you made to the landlord, so make sure when you complain you keep a copy safe. We can help you to get a response from your landlord where we have evidence that your landlord isn't following its own complaint procedures and also our complaint handling code. The landlord stage 1 complaint response isn't just an email update. It should clearly set out all of the things that you can see on the screen. So it should set out what stage of the complaint procedure you're at, a summary of the issues that you've raised, the landlord's decision on your complaint and its reasons for those decisions, any remedies that it's offered to put things right. So this might be an apology, it might be compensation. It should include details of any actions that the landlord will take to put things right, and also details of how you can take your complaint to the next stage of the process if you are still unhappy. So I mentioned earlier that your landlord will have a two-stage complaint process. So if you're unhappy with your landlord's stage 1 response, you can then escalate your complaint to stage 2. And stage 2 is the final stage of the landlord's complaint process. So the landlord must acknowledge the request within 5 working days and provide a stage 2 response in writing within 20 working days. So like the stage 1 response, your landlord has 5 working days to acknowledge, but it has 20 working days to respond. You can see on the screen there that the complaint handling code states that residents are not required to explain their reasons for requesting a stage 2 consideration. Landlords are expected to make reasonable efforts to understand why a resident remains unhappy as part of its stage 2 response. So it is the landlord's responsibility to make reasonable efforts to understand why it is you're still unhappy. They should be reaching out to you to find out why you remain dissatisfied. If you do request to escalate your complaint to stage 2, you should clearly set out your complaint reference number, the date the complaint response was sent, a summary of your complaint, why it is you're unhappy with the response that your landlord provided at stage 1, what it is you'd like the landlord to do to put things right, clearly state that you'd like to escalate your complaint to stage 2, and also request confirmation of the receipt and details of when you can expect to receive a final response to your complaint. We've created a template to help you request to escalate your complaint, and we'll pop a link to this with the recording of this webinar, and you can see it on the screen, a sort of copy of that template. So I mentioned a moment ago that the landlord's stage 2 response is sometimes referred to as its final response, and this is because the complaint has come to the end of the landlord's complaint procedure. And if you're happy with the resolution offered, the landlord will close your complaint. Although your landlord may respond to your complaint in stages, its final response will make it clear that your landlord considers the matter to be closed. But if you remain dissatisfied, you can refer your complaint to us at the Housing Ombudsman Service. So you can bring a complaint to us at the Housing Ombudsman Service for investigation if the issues have not been resolved after using your landlord's complaint procedure. So when your complaint has gone through stages 1 and 2. We will only consider a complaint for investigation when we've received evidence that your landlord has supplied a full and final response to your complaint, and we'll need to see a copy of your landlord's final response, as we can only legally consider a complaint if the landlord's complaint process has ended. You'll need to tell us what you think's gone wrong and what you think the landlord should do to put things right. We can also consider a complaint if we've intervened during the complaint process and the landlord hasn't provided a response despite our efforts to work with it. A complaint needs to be referred to us within 12 months from the date of the landlord's final response. We can only consider issues which have been raised through the complaints process. So, for example, if you were to come to us with a complaint about a sink, we then wouldn't be able to look at the whole bathroom as an issue. We would only be able to look at that issue that's part of the complaint. You can accept the compensation offered to you by your landlord and still bring a complaint to us at the service, but you must be clear why you remain unhappy with its stage 2 response. It's important to note that we can only consider complaints about members of the Housing Ombudsman scheme. So all social housing landlords must be a member of our scheme, but we do also have some private landlords who are voluntary members too. If your landlord is private and they're not a member of the scheme, you can't bring your complaint to the Housing Ombudsman service. We can't consider all housing complaints. For example, a complaint about a local authority's housing allocation would be for the Local Government and Social Care Ombudsman, the LGSCO. And if we're unable to investigate your complaint, we will signpost you to other organisations that may be able to help you. We can consider a complaint from an individual resident about the actions or omissions of a member landlord that affect a resident's occupation of, or the application for a property owned or managed by a member landlord. So this could include repairs and property condition. It could include complaints about antisocial behaviour, charges and estate management. We may be able to consider certain aspects of a complaint, but not all of them. Or we might work with other ombudsmen, such as the LGSCO, to carry out a joint investigation. We cannot make a decision on the level or reasonableness of a service charge. That is outside of our remit. If we accept a complaint, we will contact you and your landlord for the information needed to investigate. And this is the evidence that we use to make our findings. So first things first, we check if we're the right ombudsman for the complaint. Once we've received your complaint and confirm it's completed the landlord's complaint process, we pass it on to our triage team for review. They decide if the issues raised fall under our remit to consider. This is also known as our jurisdiction. We'll always aim to tell you as soon as possible if the issues that you're raising should be referred to a different ombudsman or another organisation. For example, a complaint about the level of rent would be for the first tier tribunal. If we can consider the issues raised in your complaint, we will contact the landlord and request any information that we need to begin our investigation. If we cannot resolve your complaint in early resolution, or if we decide that your complaint requires a full investigation, our dispute resolution team will undertake a formal investigation. And when we investigate complaints, we make decisions by looking at the available evidence. And the purpose of our investigation is to assess whether a landlord has acted fairly and whether its actions were reasonable, taking all the circumstances of the case into account. So our investigations are based on the evidence that's available to us, as I said. So we will ask your landlord for a copy of the lease or tenancy agreement, relevant policies and procedures, copies of complaints and response, and other relevant correspondence, and that could be notes, surveys, reports, any other records that are relevant to your case. So what findings can we make then? So I mentioned earlier that the purpose of our investigation is to assess whether your landlord has responded appropriately and to decide whether its actions were fair and reasonable, and we take all those circumstances of the case into account. Once we've investigated a complaint, we'll write to you and to your landlord with our findings, and this is called a determination. So we investigate complaints based on the evidence available to us to make that finding, and there are 8 possible findings that the Ombudsman can make, and you can see those on the screen here. If a service failure is found, we will issue a finding between maladministration and severe maladministration. Severe maladministration is the highest finding of maladministration that we can make. And we can also make findings of mediation and redress too. Sometimes there are complaints that we're not able to consider, and if this is the case, we'll make a finding of outside jurisdiction. We can also issue a finding of withdrawn. This is where a resident withdraws their complaint and we're satisfied with the circumstances of them doing so. What can we tell your landlord to do? So we can make orders and recommendations to your landlord to put things right and to put you back in the position you were in before things went wrong. This might mean we ask your landlords to say sorry to you, pay you compensation, or carry out repairs. The landlord must comply with orders we make to it and show evidence that it's done so. We won't close your case until we're satisfied that the orders have been followed. So those orders aim to put things right and resolve the individual complaint, and landlords are obliged to follow our orders. We make recommendations where wider learning or improvement could improve housing services across the landlord for the benefit of other residents. So we'll work with you and your landlord to make sure it carries out those orders and recommendations to put things right. It could mean that we ask for evidence from you and from the landlord to show that it has completed a repair or paid compensation to you, for example. Unlike orders, recommendations are not enforceable. Residents should contact their caseworkers, so make sure you get in touch with your caseworker if your landlord isn't complying with the orders, and we won't close the case until we're satisfied that all the orders have been complied with. As we bring the session towards a close, I want to leave you with some quotes from residents which give an idea of the positive difference that complaints can make. So there's one on the screen there. If it wasn't for the Housing Ombudsman, then my landlord wouldn't have taken the action that it did. It was a very good investigation and I got the result that I wanted. There's another one there. When the investigation report came out, it was such a massive relief. Finally, somebody had actually listened to me. Here as well, the Ombudsman have always put things right, always put it right. If it wasn't for the Ombudsman, then I would be in the same poor conditions I was before. And the last quote there, you're incredible for coming out for someone like me. There's a power imbalance, it feels at times, but with your decision, it felt I'd finally someone who had lifted me onto a level playing field. Just some examples there of the positive impact that the complaints can have. So the easiest way to bring a complaint to the Housing Ombudsman Service is through our web form on our website. And again, we'll pop a link to the web form on our website with the details of this recording. The web form will work out when your landlord should respond by, where you are in your landlord's complaint procedure, and what assistance we're able to provide. Thank you very much for listening. That's it from me.